Howdy y'all, welcome back. Thank you for being here. Today, we will dive into the true nature of American history during the 19th century, inheriting lands. Often on my channel, we've encountered and elaborated on the theory of inheriting lands, whether already built out cities or important strategic locations with defensive purposes. There have been multiple threads seemingly interweaved into each and every narrative that we are only beginning to unravel. The best example of this can be seen in America, where we have a multitude of history that appears to have been purposefully tucked away behind specific narratives, obtuse language, and a general lack of in-depth coverage or a tying together of the broader ideas. On my channel, and in today's video, I will look to peer through that mystery, hopefully unlocking a better understanding of the more complex concepts and routinely breezed over narratives that have built American society. In 1841, at the height of the Industrial Revolution, as photography was being introduced to America, we have the passing of the Preemption Act of 1841, the first major act officially allowing the inheriting of lands in the United States. I mean that quite literally, as we are told all unclaimed land that fell within federal territory was then open to be claimed. The price was $1.25 per acre, and to qualify, you had to be at least 21 years old, or the head of a household, a United States citizen, or have applied for citizenship, and you must have already resided on the land for 14 months. The last part of those stipulations are what really caught my attention. We're told that you quite literally had to go and start a life from scratch many times on pieces of land that were sometimes already occupied by indigenous people and even other settlers. To gain the permanent title for the land, the Preemption Act also required you stay and work the land for at least 5 consecutive years. While the Preemption Act of 1841 did have some direct impact, we're also told that many colonists and homesteaders simply traveled to these lands and settled them without ever paying the government. Again, this paints quite a picture of what was going on in America during this time period. For all intents and purposes, conquering the West was organized chaos, only heightened by the ongoing conflicts taking place on American soil and abroad. As the Great Revolution swept through Europe, leading many to vacate their homelands for fledgling America, with promises of open land for the taking, Congress passed the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850. Essentially, this act opened up the entire Oregon Territory for inheriting, which included what are today the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and large parts of Wyoming. However, seemingly at the basis of this act was the removal of indigenous and other non-white settlers from the western lands. We're told this was the most generous land distribution bill in history for certain groups, offering 320 acres to single applicants and 640 acres to couples at $1.25 per acre. However, the Oregon Land Donation Act decimated and completely disenfranchised those who had already called this land home for generations. Most of the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest lost their entire communities as they were barred from owning land. The largest trees of all time were also said to have been felled during this occupation. seemingly indicating the shifting of the proverbial guard that was taking place behind the scenes. The Oregon Land Donation Act was also the first of its kind to allow for women to accrue land as the head of a household. We're also told the plot or map of the planned layout of San Francisco was created during this time period, which had to be created by a ship offshore. I can only wonder if this was because San Francisco was already occupied and maybe even already built out, but I digress. This also leads us directly into the Civil War, and the timing couldn't be more fascinating. Essentially, we're told Southern Democrats wanted to continue opening up Western America for the creating of massive plantations. These plantations, as you may know, ran on slave labor, and as many struggled, a few lined their pockets and became rich. Obviously, this is not very conducive to a successful society, and the nepotism in these plantation families mimicked a feudal system in America. What we know about these southern powerhouses, however, can really only be deduced from what we read in the history books. And as you know, history is written by the winners. We've discussed in great length the extremes of banking, as well as some of the secret elite families which ran the American South prior to the Civil War. But something I have not mentioned before is the Homestead Act of 1860, which appears to have also been a catalyst for the outbreak of the Great Conflict. The information here is scarce, but we're told Northern Republicans passed a bill through Congress which allowed for the selling of all lands west of the Mississippi River at the unequivocally low price of 25 cents per acre, about $1 cheaper than the lowest prices ever offered for land in America by the government. The question becomes, what exactly was manifest destiny in the context of inheriting lands? The narrative continues by claiming that Republicans actually wanted all lands to the west to be completely free, at no cost to the American people, but the 25 cents per acre price was a concession offered to appease the Democrats. While the bill passed Congress, it was immediately vetoed by James Buchanan, the only president from my hometown, and the president that many claim led us directly to the Civil War. Could Buchanan's vetoing of the Homestead Act of 1860 have been a more direct cause for the conflict? One of the very first acts signed into law following Southern secession was the Homestead Act, was signed into action by new President Abraham Lincoln, albeit with slightly higher prices. The first man to file a claim under this new act was Daniel Freeman. What a coincidence. While land prices quickly increased, the United States government granted over 1.6 million homesteads from 1862 through 1934, which included over 270 million acres of land. Try to quantify that for a minute. What's furthermore, the reasoning behind this act is also somewhat nefarious. As I mentioned earlier, Southern plantations had a structure where it was hard for the society around them to thrive, as class systems appeared to rule everything. Yet, the North, in the Homestead Act, offered such low prices, basically giving the land away for free, because they desired for the majority of America to become what were known as yeomen, a term coined back in Renaissance England. But essentially, the Republicans wanted the majority of America to be working class farmers, as this was said to make them more pious, more loyal, and less likely to cause a revolution, more subservient. Following the conclusion of the Civil War, during the time period coined Reconstruction, we have nearly all the massive Southern plantations having been destroyed or confiscated by the American government. The Southern Homestead Act of 1866 looked to offer these massive farms and the accompanying architecture to the poor farmers of the South in hopes of converting them to support the Republican Party. We're told this 1866 act was mostly a failure, and most of the plantations grew dilapidated and they were torn down. However, on my channel, don't we like to nitpick these narratives? Within the Southern Homestead Act of 1866 literature, it makes note of claiming that these plantations and farmlands had become extremely overgrown, and most were dense forests, which made clearing them nearly impossible for the poor farmers. How did plantations that were in usage in 1860 become completely overgrown and forested by 1866? And why I mention that is the next great land act signed by the American Congress was none other than the Timber Culture Act of 1873, which basically claimed we didn't have enough trees to keep developing America. The Timber Culture Act granted 160 acres of land to a homesteader for free if they agreed to plant 40 acres of trees, a number that was later reduced to only 10 acres to qualify. The only reasoning given for this act is that we're told the Homestead Act that was signed earlier by Lincoln caused many to clear their lands of trees, and Congress wanted to make sure that America still had enough trees. Does that make much sense to you? The last act I wanted to talk to you about before getting into some more of the juicy details of this forgotten history is the Indian Homestead Act of 1875. While we're told this act was passed to allow for indigenous people to purchase land under the earlier Homestead Act, it actually had the opposite effect. Essentially, this act was used as a way to document indigenous people as they were required to register within the United States government to qualify for these land grants. This further disenfranchised the indigenous people, and it also created divisions within the tribe, as wealthier groups could then purchase land out from under less wealthy indigenous people. Many of the indigenous people refused to register or to purchase their land, and even more refused to leave their homes, towns, and settlements, especially given the fact many had only recently forcibly been relocated there. One example of this, probably the most important example we can reference, and something which I will expand on shortly, but in 1836, we have the signing of the Treaty of Dakota between the United States and the Cherokee people. The Cherokee, who dominated the American South, were forced to move to designated Indian Territory in what is today Oklahoma. Originally, the Cherokee were promised 7 million acres and a land patent, meaning they had full rights to the land. However, by 1838, the Cherokee had still not left their homestead in Georgia, and the land patent was nowhere to be seen. The lies of the hand that feeds. The United States then forcibly moved the Cherokee to Oklahoma in 1838 in what became known as part of the Trail of Tears. Census numbers claim over 16,000 Cherokee were relocated, but modern scholars believe the true number is actually much higher, with some claiming it was well over 25,000. This new tract of land became known as Cherokee Outlet and was roughly 60 miles wide and 225 miles long. Here is where we get to the real meat and potatoes of this discussion, what the powers that be simply did not expect us to rediscover and talk about. We're told Cherokee Outlet, according to the mainstream narrative, was, quote, seldom used or developed, even though it was occupied by over 20,000 indigenous people. We're told the Plains indigenous people still occupied the entirety of Cherokee Outlet, and they repeatedly would raid the Cherokee villages. These raids were often followed by raids by white settlers looking to steal cattle. Now, there isn't actually any proof of this next part, but the narrative claims the Cherokee then supported the South during the Civil War, as roughly 7.5% of the Cherokee were slaveholders, a rather small percentage. Furthermore, we have William Seward, staunch supporter of Abraham Lincoln, who in 1860 said that the Cherokee and all other indigenous people should be removed from America. Not sure what newspapers the Cherokee were reading, but this news eventually reached them, and they vowed their support for the democratic South. Again, this is all according to the current narrative. But let's say that the Cherokee Outlet, this massive tract of land, was actually developed and did have large settlements. Just a hypothetical. But if we can imagine that, then the next piece of this history becomes even more poignant. We're told following the Civil War, angry and looking to punish the Cherokee, who were only trying to survive, Abe Lincoln and the U.S. Congress restructured their treaty with the Cherokee and called for all Cherokee to be entirely removed from the Cherokee Outlet. I've covered similar narratives regarding the Susquehanna, who were forcibly moved to Washington, D.C. before it was developed, seemingly sent to develop the land before being forcibly moved to Lancaster, PA, where they were eventually pushed to extinction. The Cherokee, obviously, refused to leave their settlements in Cherokee Outlet, creating a decades-long conflict with the U.S. government, which eventually employed some pretty nefarious tactics to try to remove the Cherokee. First, the United States began pressuring the Kansas indigenous people, like the Osage, to sell their lands to the government and recommended they then buy the Cherokee Outlet. Mind you, the Americans were lining their pockets with every transaction. By 1872, the Osage had begun buying up property forcibly sold by the Cherokee in Cherokee Outlet, using funds that were provided to them by the United States government. This process continued through 1890, but the Cherokee were said to have still dominated Cherokee Outlet, much to the chagrin of U.S. President Benjamin Harrison, who then ordered it illegal for cattle to graze in the entire Cherokee Outlet, thus rendering the land unusable. Having no use for the land, the Cherokee were then forced to sell off their remaining pieces of Cherokee Outlet for next to nothing. What followed was one of the most mysterious events in United States history. The 1890 Organic Act officially created the Oklahoma Territory and the Indian Territory, and was considered one of the last acts of the Reconstruction of America. The intent was the assimilation of the tribes in Oklahoma territories through the elimination of the tribe's communal ownership of property. This was not a new practice. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by Andrew Jackson, sought to relocate all indigenous groups east of the Mississippi to west of the Mississippi. However, the main location chosen for this relocation was what is today the state of Oklahoma. This was America's largest Indian territory and eventually included the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, referred to as the 5 civilized tribes of America by the United States government. Essentially, because small pockets of these indigenous people were slave owners, we're told the United States government, following the Civil War, turned on all of them and sought to discredit them and remove them from their land. Yet at the core of all of this was business. The Cherokee Outlet was run by the Cherokee Strip Livestock Association, who worked as an intermediary between the indigenous people and the Europeans. This association was dissolved in 1890. After great pressure, the Cherokee Commission sold what remained of Cherokee Outlet to the United States in 1893 for a sum of just over $8 million, which was not actually paid until 1964. This led directly to the Land Run of 1893, the largest land run in American history and possibly the largest land run in all of recorded history. Also known as the Cherokee Outlet Opening or the Cherokee Strip Land Run, this land run marked the opening of the entire Cherokee Outlet to incoming settlers. This created a few terms you may be familiar with but may not have known their origin. The boomers arose in the late 19th century as Americans who believed that the unassigned lands of indigenous territories should be opened up to all settlers. Boomers had a direct impact on Congress, as in 1889, all public domain land was made available for purchase. However, the boomers were not satisfied and called for additional indigenous lands to be opened for settlement. As always, you know how I like to bring things full circle. The Great Panic of 1893 was the most serious American economic depression up until that point in history, only surpassed by the Great Depression. The Panic of 1893 saw massive declines in profits from agriculture, attributed to poor growth in many Eastern American cities. Thus, the great farmers of America, mostly all boomers, further pushed for the opening of Cherokee Outlet as a way to jumpstart America's economy. The concept finally had enough traction that Congress approved the land run to begin at noon on September 16, 1893. By October of that same year, following the land run, the country was out of the economic depression. However, the land run itself is something to behold. Oklahoma is home to the Sooners, but do you know who the Sooners actually are? Sooner rather than later, Sooners were individuals who entered into lands being sold at land runs before the land run actually began. While technically not legal, the Sooners operated on a first-come, first-served policy, and it was actually the Sooners who ended up inheriting the largest and most fertile pieces of land. Little is known of the Sooner culture, as at first, the name Sooner had a very negative connotation, someone who had stolen from other settlers. While boomers were seen as engaging the pioneer spirit and doing things, quote, by the book, Sooners were seen as criminals. Yet, within roughly 15 years, the Sooner farms flourished alongside the boomer farms, and the economic gains dissipated the public outcry against the Sooners. So much so that by 1908, the University of Oklahoma football team became known as the Sooners, and the title has become synonymous with the history of Oklahoma. But the history doesn't just wrap up nicely there, as no narrative like this could ever end with a ribbon on top. From the Cherokee Outlet Land Run, we are told 7 new counties were formed, all 7 of which were previously known to the United States government by letter designations, K through Q, meaning the United States already had this land mapped out entirely before the land grab, and they already knew what they were going to do with the land following the land grab. It was order out of chaos. We're told many colonists found success in Cherokee Outlet. However, many of the cities and settlements did not thrive, and many did not survive. We're told this was due to the cities being, and I quote, overbuilt. We're told the cities of Cherokee Outlet were constructed or founded to be too large for the populations that settled them, and they became difficult to maintain. The land was quickly overfarmed in certain locations, and those towns and settlements were also said to have been abandoned. While the land run of Cherokee Outlet was the largest in American history and possibly the largest event of its kind in all of human history, it also resulted in the founding of massive towns which the settlers couldn't handle, which fell into disrepair and have today been lost, torn down, or in some lucky instances have become ghost towns. What existed in America prior to the Industrial Revolution, and why does that time period always appear to be the catalyst for the rapid growth of America, both literally and figuratively? The epic, sprawling settlements of the indigenous people, decimated by years of policies which quite literally worked to hide the key facets of their history. Relocating certain groups to other areas to inherit history, renovating entire communities to allow for a European history to take hold, the cultivation of a massive following, the boomers and the sooners, who thought it was prudent to take away these most important lands of the indigenous people, and the North and South, sworn enemies of the 19th century, yet the whole of America seemed to be working hand in hand to eradicate the true nature of early American history. I wouldn't be doing the history of Oklahoma proper justice without mentioning the oil boom that occurred here as well. The first oil was said to have been struck when Oklahoma was still completely indigenous territory, and this occurred in 1859. However, by 1897, right after the massive land run that then distributed all of these new settlers throughout the landscape, almost immediately we have them drilling into the land, digging into the land. And that's a similar narrative that we see throughout the 19th century. It was a common practice that individuals seemed to be digging for something, whether it was oil or water or other things like that. But in the South, we have the discovery of massive mounds, these burial locations for the mound builders and other indigenous cultures. Here in Oklahoma, we're told they were digging for oil, but they were digging within these landscapes that played an important role to the indigenous people. This first commercial oil well in Oklahoma, the Nellie Johnston, came into production near Bartlettsville, starting the boom that would go on to redefine Oklahoma as an oil capital of America. Mound builders, architects of the past, thought leaders, medicine men, great warriors, great inventions, castles, fortifications, all of which were formed without the influence of Europeans. And the history was then taken away through land grabs and homestead acts, which, when we read between the lines, almost all focused on erasing the truth behind indigenous American history.